Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and it's great to be back on here with my good friend, Dr. Peter Carmichael. And the title of tonight's talk is Refighting the Civil War. Does Tactical History Matter? So, good evening, Pete.
John, how are you? We still didn't come up with our theme song yet.
I know. We need to
That
come
will
up
be
with
our
it.
homework over the weekend. I have become obsessed with Duke Ellington. I think
Oh,
he's a genius. And so
yeah,
I would probably be pushing some Duke Ellington. And I suspect we might be safe with one of Duke's songs in terms of copyright infringement.
probably. Yeah, that
I'd be
that would
for
help.
that. I'm for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
I don't
that's,
want to get on. I don't want to call my lawyer all of a sudden.
I don't either. Well, tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Drew Bledsoe. And Drew, tell us how, at what age did it become annoying when people would constantly refer to Drew Bledsoe, the quarterback? Or is it something you've just come to live with and accept?
Well, yeah, I had never heard of Drew Bledsoe, the quarterback. I guess he was a quarterback at maybe Washington State, and then suddenly he became this big thing. And uh, I don't know. I'm not quite sure how it happened, but I don't hear as many Drew Bledsoe jokes anymore. Fortunately, because I guess he's retired and all that. But
Yeah.
when he was playing, I was really honestly anxious. I thought, I really hope this guy doesn't do something humiliating or embarrassing, and then I have to live with this for the rest of my life.
Wasn't there a Seinfeld episode in which one of the Elaine was dating a man who had the same name as some like
Yeah.
mass murder or something
Yep.
like that.
Yep.
And she convinced him to change his name.
Yep.
Yes, you're
Yeah.
lucky. Drew Bledsoe is now, as you maybe know, he owns a vineyard, I believe in Oregon. I believe in.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
So that's
All
a
right.
fairly safe occupation. It'd be hard to
Yes.
do something humiliating.
Yeah. Respectable.
Respectable. That's
Yes.
right. So let me just tell our friends in the audience this evening that Drew is PhD from Rice University, but before he embarked on his PhD in history, he was a lawyer. And where did you do your law degree? Was it Arkansas? Or no?
Tennessee, University of
You did
Tennessee.
Tennessee,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
And so he left the law and became a professional historian. His dissertation was published by LSU, Citizen Officers. You all see that right there.
Yeah.
It is an outstanding book. And again, especially when you consider it was his dissertation. I mean, it's a really, really good book. And as for a first book, it's really quite remarkable. So, an outstanding piece of scholarship. And it's with this book that Drew is now at Lee University in Tennessee. And he just said it was roughly 20-minute drive to the east of Chattanooga. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
20, 30 minutes or so, and not
Yeah.
far from Chickamauga as well. And so it is a pleasure to have Drew here. Drew doesn't know this, or maybe he does. You were slated to come to CWI for 2021, but uh, we are now, of course, trying to rethink what that lineup will look like. You all will get a sneak peek here because I know that Drew at some point will certainly come and join us in Gettysburg. So tonight's discussion, our conversation, is going to be loosely based upon Drew's piece in the Journal of Civil War History. It's like I have a lot of show and tell here. The Journal of Civil War, excuse me, the Journal of the Civil War era, excuse me. It is published by UNC Press. And in this issue, and I'm trying to get to my title here. Oh, that's Rachel's piece. The current editors are fairly new. It is Greg Downs and Kate Mazer. They are the current editors. But this journal is a journal that, again, I think for a lot of Civil War enthusiasts who probably read Civil War Times or The Monitor, this is something they might not be familiar with. I think it is something that certainly is worth your time. And so it was Drew's piece, and our audience, Drew, is aware that it was available to them on our website, the Gettysburg Compiler, our website being the CWI website. So a lot of folks have read it. So we've got that to sort of, if we need to, we can draw from. But I would just like for you to help our audience understand what you mean by traditional military history. And I thought if we had something that you could refer to, and we'll go to a classic, and this is, again, my glare I can see is a little rough here. It's Douglas Southall Freeman's Lee's Lieutenants. This is the first volume. It's important to give you the subtitle. And the subtitle is A Study in Command. This is a classic in the field, and I'll just quickly say it was a book that almost all my peers back in the day read. This is a book that I think would be pretty hard to find. Obviously, you could get it on Amazon, but it's not the mainstay that it once was at a commercial bookshop. So, Drew, tell us a little bit about traditional military history. What is it? And maybe help us understand it in reference to Freeman's book.
Sure, absolutely. Well, John and Pete, again, thanks so much for letting me hang out with you guys. I really appreciate this. The sort of the conversation about traditional military history, at least for me, really kind of began in around 2014. Earl Hess and Gary Gallagher and Katie Shively published a pair of State of the Field essays looking at traditional military history and its place in Civil War studies among academics. And one of the things that I think both of these pieces talk about is how they are concerned that traditional military history is slipping away in some ways, or has slipped away from the academic study of the Civil War, meaning that there's a sense that there's maybe a generation of Civil War historians who don't really know much about the war part of the Civil War. So, but as far as defining it, I think there are a lot of ways to define it, and it's honestly kind of a slippery definition. Early, we probably would have defined traditional Civil War military history as campaign and battle studies. Drum and trumpet sometimes is used for this sort of thing, and sometimes in a kind of a denigrating way, and I don't think it should be. But the idea here is that you're looking at what takes place on a battlefield or during a campaign or some sort of military operation that involves tactics and strategy and weapons and generals and soldiers and that sort of thing. Right. So to me, that's kind of honestly a narrow definition. And I think that definition has, in the last probably couple of decades, has really matured, or at least evolved in all sorts of new ways, which I'd love for us to be able to talk about.
So tell us, how does Freeman exemplify the very best of traditional military history, and where do you see in Freeman as reflecting or revealing some of the limitations of traditional military history?
Yeah, good. Well, this is a huge undertaking. Was it 3 volumes? And in each of these volumes is how many pages? I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of pages each. So you're talking about a major undertaking to sit down and read through all of this. I will admit that, I have read through the whole series once, but I will fall back repeatedly on the single volume abridged version when I need to look at this thing, because it's just huge, right? It's not something you can just put in your duffel and take to the battlefield and read on little round top, right? But at the same time, the subject is such a huge one that I think that level of exhaustive detail is necessary. But it really is, I think, probably as traditional as it can be, in the sense that Freeman focuses on generals, he focuses on leaders. He's really interested in command and command decisions, sort of the things that leaders in war do, particularly Confederate leaders, that shape the outcomes of military operations. But although it is extremely traditional, it is very much drum and trumpet sort of stuff. And of course, if you look, you can see the lost cause in a lot of what he does. But at the same time, I think Freeman is maybe a little underrated in the sense that he was innovative. Some of the things that Freeman attempted, I don't know that other military historians have even tried to do what he did, including playing around with things like perspective using this fog of war technique that he really, I think, pretty interestingly wove throughout the whole work, where you sort of try to limit your analysis to what you understand the commander at the time should have or could have known, rather than using kind of hindsight to evaluate what happened. So to me, that's really interesting.
And that technique he used with great effect in his 4 volumes on R.E. Lee, which he also received the Pulitzer Prize for. I mean, I think that you've hit Freeman's great gift. It was his ability to be able to capture the personalities within Lee's high command and able to show, as I think you think is something that now is currently being overlooked, and that is the influence in which these individuals had in shaping the outcome of events. And we have, over time, because we're all nervous of being charged of subscribing to the big man theory of history. And of course, with Freeman's Lee's lieutenants, you certainly get a glimpse of the rank and file, but you get really Lee, his corps commanders, and then he makes his way all the way down to division and brigade level. And we should also add that it's masterful research. Douglas Southall Freeman grew up very much kind of in the Confederate world. As a little boy, he remembered seeing Jubal Early walk down the streets of Lynchburg.
Wow.
Freeman's father was a veteran of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And I think it was the moment in which Freeman saw, in essence, a reenactment of the crater. Of course, without the detonation right, and the grand explosion. But he saw some veterans, I believe, from Mahone's brigade at the crater. And that was something that made such an impression upon him that he then proceeded to work on this, again, I think, magnificent book. And if I have it close to hand, and I do.
It's in there somewhere.
So,
oh, yeah.
Could you, Drew, General Lee's Army, Joe Glatar, again, a man whose work in the field, especially on soldier studies, has been more influential than anyone else I can think of. Can you, Drew, kind of tell us about how this book reflects some of this new military history that was lacking in Freeman's volumes?
Yeah, and you're right. This is, I think, an incredibly important book for a lot of reasons. But to me, what General Lee's Army does history that we have been hearing about for so long in such a really effective way. The way that Joe Glatzar is able to weave in statistical analysis and demographics and just hard data to kind of tell his story and to make his arguments is pretty remarkable. I mean, we know, I think, more about the Army of Northern Virginia because of this book than maybe any other book that I can think of that came before. We know everything about what the percentage of the officer corps were slaveholders, or what their ages were, what their backgrounds were, their economic and social and cultural backgrounds, and all the sort of things that create the identity of a military force. Joe is able to bring that all to bear in this volume, and it's just to me, it's a masterwork of how to do, I guess, what we would call the new military history.
It's phenomenal, and the depth of research is again, there's very few books that I can think of in the Civil War field that does what Joe was able to do in the archives. I mean, he's a research archive rat, right? You know, and they're about gym rats. Joe Glatar is an archive rat, and what he was able to extract from the archives in terms of original sources. And then, as you just said, to be able then to look at all aspects of the life of the Army of Northern Virginia, and to look at the relationship of slaves and soldiers in the Army. He has a chapter on that. He looks at the relationship to home front. He has a chapter on the nature of combat. And he does all of that, and he still follows the narrative thread of the Army coming into existence in 1861, really 1862, but going from 61 all the way to its demise. Yeah, it's a remarkable achievement. And I think speaks to what you've just said, shows how the field has changed so much in a pretty short period of time, like the last 15 years.
Mhm.
Um,
Drew, what do you think are some one or two of the major traps that we have encountered along the way as a people who just pick up a book off a bookshelf and start reading it, where when we're talking about tactical history or military doctrine or stuff? What do you think are some of the things that we have kind of lacked, as far as understanding it, where we've fallen into this precipice of we kind of gloss over certain things, or it just doesn't compute?
Yeah, yeah. There I think are some kind of persistent notions, or even I hate to say myths because that's a loaded term, but there are some ideas about Civil War combat and about the military aspects of the Civil War that are really persistent and have gone unchallenged really for a long time. And really only recently are we starting to see historians sort of attack them and rethink them. I'm thinking in particular ideas about the destructiveness of the war. And in particular, when you look at, let's say, Earl Hess's book on the rifle musket, and then Patty Griffith's book on Civil War combat, which came out in the 80s, but has been pretty influential, to sort of rethink what we think we know about traditional Civil War military history. So the idea that instructive and that sort of thing. I think Earl has made a pretty interesting and compelling case that the Civil War is not necessarily more destructive than, let's say, the Napoleonic Wars, when you look at casualties and firefights and battles and that sort of thing. And so, try to get that idea to penetrate the consciousness of the average Civil War reader is actually pretty hard. Because many people have grown up thinking, well, rifles dominated the Civil War battlefield, and this was a war that was fought with modern technology and outdated tactics and all that. And I don't know that that's necessarily the right way to think about the Civil War. Of course, there are many other examples of all sorts of ways that I think we kind of mess up the Civil War when it comes to looking at the military stuff. That's just one example. I could think of others off the top of my head.
Drew, in your article, you speak of the chessboard approach, and it's a chessboard approach that you take issue with. And so let's again sort of define for everyone, what did you mean by the chessboard approach? And then tell me what's the issue here? What's the problem?
Yeah, and I don't want that to serve as a criticism, particularly of one of my favorite Civil War historians and one that's really important to me personally, Bruce Catton, right? I love Bruce Catton. I grew up loving the Golden Book of the Civil War. That's, I think, partly what made me want to become a Civil War historian. But at the same time, Bruce Catton and other kind of centennial era Civil War historians, they tend to try to look at the war as a chess match. And they tend to look at generals and commanders in particular as these chess players. And the armies are pieces on the board, and it's this grand contest of strategy and it's that sort of thing. And there's no doubt that there is that's part of the story. But what I tried to do in my piece, and what I want to try to incorporate in my thinking about the Civil War, is that it's really not a chess match at all. In fact, managing military operations in the 19th century, or maybe really at any point, is inherently complicated and inherently chaotic. And in many cases, battles and campaigns can spiral out of the control of the chess master even before they realize it. So I would suggest that when we look at things from the perspective of this being a chess match, that's distorting the way that I think the people who lived through it probably looked at it. So it's not a contest between two generals necessarily staring at each other across a chessboard, as much as it is trying to accomplish limited goals and then adapting to uncertain outcomes as they are sort of thrown at you. It's just a different mentality, I think.
Yeah, the point of contingency, which you talk about at great length in this piece, which I think the audience would be interested in. But and maybe John wants to jump in here. I'm going to give you a little bit of pushback on this point, because
Okay.
if your criticisms, if one embraces them, right, agrees with them, how can anyone be comfortable with any tactical history? I mean, we've got so many fine examples. This is Stephen Sears, for those of you who've not read Stephen Sears. I think most of his campaign studies, beginning with his book on Antietam, he did the 7 Days campaign, did Chancellorsville, then Gettysburg. I think they're fine books, and I think they often reflect some of this new military history. But this chessboard approach, is it not impossible to move away from? Because it's our job as historians to create a degree of coherence, right? To create a narrative that's accessible and that makes sense. And so what I think we maybe should be telling our readers and telling visitors on the battlefield, what we're creating for you is artificial. And to give you something that's understandable and accessible, we are actually denying what was the very essence of the chaos of battle. So I agree with exactly with what you're saying, but it leads me to ponder, like, all this work on tactical history that, and we've got the nice smooth maps that accompany it as well.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a degree of sort of, I know it's the right word, of dishonesty that we are practicing as Civil War historians in our writing and in our talks, because at the end of the day, we're still reaffirming the chessboard approach.
Yeah, well, and I think that it's an interesting way to look at it, Pete. And I think also what you also, I think, may be touching on too is not just the chessboard approach, but the idea of hindsight as a whole, something that historians are always grappling with when we're looking at what happened in the past. You know, the way that we look at, let's say, a command decision or, you know, a tactical attempt on something, or whatever that might be. We look at it in 2020, looking back, and we say, well, we know what happened. We know what the other side was thinking when this particular person made this decision. We know the outcome, and we understand a lot more about what was going on and what was about to take place than the people who lived through it. But and it's impossible to get away from that. There's no doubt. I mean, we have more or less perfect information about a lot of this stuff, and they certainly didn't at the time. But my larger point, that one that I was trying to make, is that when we're evaluating the chessboard of war, when we're looking at what happened, what a general did or a colonel did or a sergeant did or whatever that is it really the right question to ask when we ask ourselves, did they behave correctly or not? Or was this a smart choice or not? Should Sickles have pushed the salient into the peach orchard or not? I mean, yeah, we can ask that, but what's the point? He did, right?
Right. Yeah, you certainly in your piece you take issue.
He formed that decision. You know, what pressures was he facing? What were the cultural command pairs? That is a more useful, maybe more fruitful approach. And I think that also helps us understand how contingency can shape what took place on the battlefield, and of course what springs from that later.
So John gives a fair number of battlefield tours, and after, of course, reading Drew's piece, John, I'm interested, how do you, in your tours, create for your audience a degree of chaos? How do you instill a sense of what the essence of combat's about? It's you're in the maelstrom, right? And it's utter mayhem. So, John, I'm curious, how do you try to do that when you're giving battlefield tours?
I think for me, it's part of trying to understand who I'm speaking to, because you're talking to people who are either just being introduced to this concept for the first time, or they've been in it a while and they want something a little bit deeper. Because I think, we're still we're still working with different levels of historian, and we're all coming together to make this mold happen. And to create that chaos and such, there are numerous ways to do that. When I'm out there, I'm constantly going back to my old ways, which is the old tactician in me. You know, I'm guilty of that, where I grew up on Catton, and I grew up on, you know, thinking of these guys as the chess masters. And so sometimes I'm thinking about it in that way, and I have to bring myself back and say, well, wait a minute, I got to think about this from the bottom up instead of the top down. And the chaos for me is telling people about how many working parts are involved. If Lee makes a decision, it has to go down this many tiers to get to a brigade or a regiment. And the communication issues and distance and ideas like that, because I feel we're separated from that today. We take it as, we see it as very clean. Lee orders this to be done and it's done. And we don't see all the moving parts in between. We don't see the staff officers doing what they need to do, the couriers doing what they need to do. Because I've been out there and people have talked to me about the first day at Gettysburg, and they'll say, well, why didn't Lee just turn the column around and leave? Well, it's not that easy. It's not, we're not playing Sid Meier's Gettysburg here. We got, you know, we got 60,000 men coming down the road. So the chaos for me is telling people just the sheer amount of people who are out on that spot at that one particular time, putting it in normal context that we would understand. Like if we were watching a sporting event, I would use a stadium as an idea of how many people are out here. And then the moving parts that go along with that. Even before the mini balls start flying and the artillery shells start shrieking in, just the understanding that there's that much chaos already, because you could say we're going to do this and this, but as Drew says in the piece, it's never that tidy. You know, it's always like a sand table in World War II or anything like that. We're going to go here to here, but it never works out that way. There's always different ways to go around it.
I would also, maybe if I could interject too, John, I would suggest that even the evidence that we use as historians can sometimes work against us, because, you know, so often what we understand about a tactical situation or a battle or engagement, we draw from the OR, the official records. And those are often what we would today probably call after action reports, right? That are written by participants, sometimes days or weeks or even months after the fact. And what they try to do in these things is to impose some order on what was honestly an inherently often chaotic situation. So we're having to filter what we understand through a filter that is imposed on it by participants purposefully, because they want clarity and that sort of thing. So we lose something, I think, about the actual experience of battle, and sometimes in multiple layers, until we can actually kind of get a sense of what may have actually happened. And we may really never know what it was truly like to be in Wheatfield at Gettysburg, or you know, to be at the break at Chickamauga, or whatever. And I don't know that we can recover some of that, which is a problem.
Right. I think that for our battlefield tours, and I'm going to do this at the next CWI, before we walk across Pickett's Charge, or maybe the Wheatfield's better, go to the Wheatfield. You know what they often do between innings when they bring the, you know, the kids out and they're, you know, trying to hawk some awful product, and you have to put your nose on a bat and go around in circles, right? And you do that like 10 times, and then you have to run to first base, and of course you're dizzy and confused. I think that that's how you start a walking tour on a battlefield, right? Make them go around 10 times and then send them off. That'll create the days. And
smoke machines, lots of smoke. Right?
And feed them spaghetti beforehand to make it even more entertaining.
What's in the General Pickett's buffet? General Pickett's buffet is good. And they do some nice work in this town. They have one night in which the Boy Scouts, they do all the cooking, all the serving, and they get 100% of the profits. The Boy Scouts do. It's really nice. Wow. It's a good place. Yeah, no, yeah. It's worth checking out. You know, I'm thinking though about some of the things that both of you had just said. It reminds me of the approach of sensory history. Mark Smith of the University of South Carolina did a nice little book on sensory history and the Civil War. We have, of course, I have all these books out here right now. Evan, here, mentioned this on Monday night. Evan Kutzler's new book on prison life, but from a sensory approach. Drew, I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about what sensory history might be able to do to enhance or enrich our understanding of traditional military history.
Yeah, it's a new field to me. I've read the Living by Inches book, and I really like it. I think it's
Really
pretty
good.
fascinating.
Really good.
The sensory experience of war is probably impossible to replicate, but I think that it's something that tends to get left out of contemporary accounts. I mean, you'll hear about the roar of cannon and all that, the thunder of battle, and you hear all this elaborate kind of Victorian descriptions of these sorts of things. But I mean, there is no doubt that this is a scary, loud, terrifying experience, a Civil War battle that's full of smells and sounds and sights and things that are just impossible to maybe for us to understand. And unfortunately, it seems like so many of these participants in battles will write the sites were indescribable, and then they'll move on with their account or whatever it is. And the whole time, historians like us are thinking, well, describe it for us. We want to know what you're talking about, right? So, in that sense, that might be history that's maybe a little difficult to recover. I'm not sure. I haven't actually looked at it from that perspective. But I mean, there's no doubt that when you go to a park like Gettysburg, which is beautiful and manicured and just really, perfectly situated where you can see everything, and it's just really nice. It's easy to forget the chaos and the blood and the mud, and especially the clouds of smoke that would cover everything, and that would just make battle such an overwhelming experience. John Keegan in The Face of Battle talks a lot about that, the literal fog of war. And it's something I think that military historians ought to continue to keep in mind, that we ought to try to incorporate maybe more of that into our analysis when we're thinking about what happened in a battle. Think about what the physical environment was and what the sensory input that these people are experiencing might have been too.
So I've got a question. I'm going to pull back a little bit for both of you here. And I'm going to say what I hear from both of you is something that might have some unfortunate consequences in how we connect with our general audiences. I think both of you are kind of sucking the fun out of Civil War history. What's wrong with being an armchair general? Hell, people love to do that kind of thing, right? Get on that battlefield or to read a book and to start, of course, pointing fingers and casting judgments. And if this person had done that, or they should have done this. And I suspect there are a lot of people who are watching this and listening to this and thinking, good God Almighty, what's wrong with academic historians? Damn, it's fine as it is. We enjoy it. It's interesting. It's engaging. And you want to take that away from us and say, no armchair generalship. It's pointless. Yeah. It's counterproductive. And so what's your response to that?
I would say, please do not be soured on Civil War history because of the things that we're saying here today. that I completely, I agree. I mean, I got sucked into Civil War history as a kid because I wanted to be an armchair general. I wanted to be a real general. I mean, I wanted to be the guy on the horse waving the sword and leading the charges and all that. And maybe there's still some of that in me, and it probably always will be. So, I mean, honestly, there's very few things I like more than to just grab a big, thick campaign history and just dive in and learn everything I can about all that stuff. So, again, please don't misunderstand. My purpose is not to tell people that, hey, you shouldn't and that sort of thing, or armchair generalship at all. In fact, quite the contrary. I think people who read that sort of history kind of keep the field of Civil War history alive. The historians who are generating works like that are the ones that are selling books, not people like me, right? I mean, go to any Civil War bookstore and you'll see all these campaign histories, and I'll love them just as much as everybody else. So really all I'm trying to do is to suggest, not necessarily for the general audience, but more for my academic colleagues who are maybe skeptical about being armchair generals, that maybe there's a way that you can live in harmony with that and even incorporate some of the traditional military history into your own work and be better as a consequence of it.
So there's a really interesting question in the comments that I'd like to ask both of you. This goes for you too, Pete, because of your latest book, and Drew, obviously. Uh, One of the people watching is Katie Rice, and she says, "Do you think we can use current military sensory descriptions of battles today from active soldiers to try to compare the two, or do you feel that they are completely different?"
Go ahead, Drew. Did you hear it?
Now his internet won't work. You got the big question.
Yeah.
You might have to take
Yeah,
it.
I'm sorry. My connection's a little.
That's
My
okay.
connection's a little
No, no,
spotty.
no.
So
I'm not going to pick on you about it. I just did you
Uh,
hear the full question, Drew, or do you
no.
need to say again?
Could you just do it real quick? Just
Sure.
real quick. What was the question?
Katie Rice asks, "Do you think we can use current military sensory descriptions of battles today from active soldiers to try to compare the two, or do you feel that they are too different?"
Yeah. Well, I think we want to be cautious when you compare wars across time. You know, the temptation is to say, well, war is universal, and the lived experience of a veteran of the Civil War is similar to the lived experience of an Afghanistan veteran or Iraqi veteran. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Now, there may be some universal conclusions we can draw about war, but at the same time, I don't know that necessarily living through Gettysburg is the same as living through, let's say, Fallujah or something like that.
Right.
So I would be careful about it. One other issue is that often we can talk to veterans today, sit them down and say, well, what was it like? What did you sense and experience? And we don't have that same ability to go back and talk to a veteran of the Civil War. We have to rely on the evidence that we have, which can, again, present all sorts of problems. But I think that it's an interesting idea. And maybe there is something there. Maybe we could in the future start trying to do some comparative studies between modern combat and Civil War combat, and see what comes of it.
So I'm going to give a shout out to one of my colleagues at Gettysburg College, Ian Isherwood, who is a World War I historian and who published a piece in this journal, which I will also give another little advertisement for, in which he does a very, I think, important comparison between World War I soldiers and Civil War soldiers. And the essence of it, and I think he's correct, is that they don't need to line up perfectly in order to make these comparisons to get some useful ideas and some conclusions that will allow us to see what is unique or exceptional about a particular experience. So I think this person's question is a good one. I think there are things in terms of the sensory experience. I'm just reading the things they carried, the World War One. Gosh, why is his name eluding me? It's not O'Brien. What's things he carried? Is it O'Brien?
Yeah, it's O'Brien.
Yeah, O'Brien.
Yeah.
Tim O'Brien.
Yep.
O'Brien. It's just a fine book. And I couldn't help but to see again some of the descriptions that these men or that he used to talk about how they interacted with the climate, whether it be the rain or the mud or the smells or the food. Certainly there are parallels there. But again, I think that, Drew, you make a good observation. There's still different ways in which the men at the time understood those smells and how they came to grips and came to terms with it. So I think that's ripe for possibilities, more so than what I ever really imagined before. But there is a problem, I hear it time and time again, in which people universalize war. And I remember giving a talk on my book, and this guy yelled out, well, have you ever been in war? And I said, no, but I've been in the archives and it's hell. I was close to saying that, right? You get paper cuts and it's dusty down there. I thought, I actually thought it was a pretty rude question. But what was behind that question is this notion that if you haven't been to war, that you somehow don't have that deep understanding of the military experience. The military experience is quite different, as Drew has already pointed out. And I would press hard on that point, and I will to the day I die. And I think a good example is, let's just talk about, I don't know, pick a charge. 50% casualties in less than an hour. and how that charge in that moment was lionized by the Richmond press. Although certainly there were criticisms that were made, but for George Pickett, the idea that this was some kind of burden or disgrace that he carried with him and that he was bitter that that old man wrecked his division is nonsense. Pickett's charge immortalized George Pickett. It immortalized the survivors. And I'll ask anyone in our audience, 50% casualties in any military operation today in Afghanistan, and how would not only the American people respond to that, but the survivors of that operation? They sure as hell wouldn't be saying glory for all. Now, they would certainly have their admiration and their respect for those men and women who had fallen in that operation, but there is a very different understanding of killing and death in the American Civil War. Our visitors and our general public, they don't want to buy that, because if they buy that, they have to see them as somehow as being different from us. I get weary of hearing, I hear it too often, people who I respect who say they were just like us. They had families, they missed their families, they loved their comrades. They love, men and women love their comrades in the Army today. I think those comparisons, I think that they border on being superficial. There you have it.
Yeah, that's something I hear
I
all
agree.
the time.
I agree. I think
Yeah.
you're right on.
Yeah, all the time.
All the time.
One thing that you brought up, Drew, in that article that I really wanted to touch on was you brought up my boy Clausewitz, and I'm like, oh, here we go. We got wars, politics by other means, and I think a lot of people don't realize that with anyone else other than like the Lincoln administration, they think Lincoln was the only politician trying to get his hands involved in it for reasons, but it was on both sides, obviously. And you went over that in here, and I thought it'd be a great thing to touch upon about how not only are there things going on in the battlefield, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking also about the home front and politics as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I don't know if he's watching, but there's a historian, Zach Fry, who's got a new book out on politics in the Army of the Potomac, which I think is a really good book. We know this is something I think historians have been paying attention to for Pete's ready. He's got it.
Yeah, he's got it. Yeah.
For a long time.
There it is.
There it is.
There it is.
Yeah. Good book. Zach, if you're watching, I really like your book. In any case, the politics is central to war. I mean, you could, I think, make a strong case that without politics, there's no Civil War, because what's the point, right? And anytime you're looking at, let's say, let's get in the weeds and talk tactical history, you can start from there, and eventually it will lead you to the politics of all of this. There's a political goal in mind. There's a reason that armies are at Gettysburg. There's a reason that that they're trying to achieve certain objectives, and often these are inherently political in nature. And of course, politics also influences decisions on the battlefield. It influences the reasons that people enlist, or maybe the reasons that they desert or evade. It influences questions about emancipation, about union, about morale. It's just it's throughout. I would argue that if you're a military historian of the Civil War, then you are also, whether you like it or not, you're also potentially a political historian of the Civil War, because they are so intertwined. They're inseparable, really.
But Drew, one of the points you make in your piece at the very end, in which you're very forceful in arguing that for academics who are not Civil War historians, but you're actually pointing to some academic Civil War historians, that when they're dismissive of military history, that they are committing a sin that they often charge others, especially military historians, and that sin being that we are not inclusive enough in our approach to the past, that we as military historians or Civil War historians are not sufficiently sensitive to issues of race and gender and class. And your point, I think, and again, I'd like for you to comment on this, is please help the audience understand why are so many academics, one, uneasy with Civil War history, that they think that it's not very serious work. not academic enough. And especially that charge is leveled by non-Civil War historians. So again, I'll just quickly say it again so you can comment on that. Why all the animosity? Why all the animosity towards Civil War historians?
Okay. Yeah. Um, I don't know that there's a simple or easy answer to that question. And again, I don't want to create a straw man situation here where I'm saying that academic historians hate military history and popular historians love it. It's certainly not at all what I'm saying. I think, but I do think that there is some discomfort among some academic Civil War historians when the military stuff comes up. And the source of that can come from a lot of places. To understand the military history of the Civil War requires some technical knowledge, right? It requires some knowledge that is not necessarily something you can intuitively understand. You have to understand how armies in the 19th century worked, how generals thought, what they were trying to achieve, the context for all that. And that's something that takes effort. Not to say that people who don't like it are lazy, not at all, but at the same time, these are skills that you may not necessarily possess, and if you want to understand the war, you have to go out and acquire those skills. Also, particularly in the context of my piece, where I focused on command and generals, I think that there is often some discomfort at looking at history through the eyes of elites or the eyes of the powerful. In this case, they're often white men on horseback grounds, and they have power and that sort of thing. And so, there's maybe that dynamic that's part of it. There's a reluctance to focus on the top, and we want to be more sensitive to the bottom or to the middle. Maybe that's part of it as well. And then, of course, there's the whole moral question of is it okay to study war at all? Are we somehow glorifying violence or glorifying war by studying it? Are we falling into the trap of turning this into a heroic narrative instead of decrying war, which is what we should do? So there are a lot of reasons, I think, to be for academics to be nervous about studying military history. I don't particularly think any of those are terribly valid. I just the point that I make is that if you're an academic Civil War historian and you purposely choose to disregard the war stuff, you're making a value judgment about what is important and what isn't. And I don't know that that's necessarily the right way to think about the past. I mean, if you want to have a full picture of what actually happened, then we need to try to understand as much about it as possible, including traditional military history. I think it will make us better historians, in other words.
Drew, I have to say the piece that you wrote for the journal, I think it was certainly the most compelling case that I've ever read in defense of traditional military history. In fact, I spoke to Chris Gwynn, who was one of our guests on the show, and suggested to him that this piece, that it would be the starting point for a conference that he and I were hoping to do in December. That's obviously not going to happen now. But it was going to be a conference just for public historians, because here we've talked on this show about the great strides that have been made in bringing public historians and academic historians together. And that notion that there's animosity between the two camps is, I think, grossly overstated. But where there is still a challenge is that public historians have demands on their time and often don't have the resources to stay engaged to what is being published. I suspect that there is very few National Park Service historians who subscribe to this, probably very few that even know of this journal. And, their lives are not any worse off because of it. But I just want to make that point, is that they often don't have access to what's, one of the most important journals in our field. The other thing that I will quickly point out, I have too many books.
Got all the books ready.
Is the book that that Drew and Andrew Lang. Andrew Lang is at Mississippi State. Andrew Lang wrote just an outstanding book on military occupation in the South. Andrew Lang has a new book coming out very soon with Michael Parrish on understanding the Civil War from an international perspective. This volume that Drew and Andrew
Yes.
did
Yeah.
has great pieces in this as well. And did you want to comment a little bit about what this book does? Because I think in many ways this book exemplifies your arguments in your article piece in your journal.
It's always when we ask a question.
There you go. Drew, give me. So Drew, when I was saying that this book, I think exemplifies what you were trying to do in your piece. Could you tell us a little bit about this book as well?
Yeah, sure. Andy, I don't know if Andy's watching. Hey, Andy, if you are watching, Andy Lang and I went to Rice together, and we were in grad school together. He's a really good friend of mine, and this book, this volume, originated between sort of a conversation Andy and I had in 2015 at the Society for Military History. We were just sort of sitting around one night after all the panels were done and just hanging out and talking, and we thought, you know what? We read the Gallagher Shively piece, we read the Hess piece, and we thought this is something that we want to talk about. We have some things that we want to say, but I think more than that, Andy and I felt that there are people that are doing great work in traditional and really otherwise sorts of military history in the Civil War that have things to say. So we were very fortunate to reach out to a lot of just really outstanding Civil War historians. Some of them are well established in their field. Some of them are young and new historians. Some of them are public historians. Some of them are non-traditional, or I know that some folks don't like this term, but they're independent historians, Kevin Levin and others. And we're very, very, very fortunate to have those folks participate. Jen Murray and others that, some of the CWI folks will know pretty well, John Hennessy. And anyway, so what we wanted to do, we wanted to kind of show what we thought maybe the future of Civil War history and military history of the Civil War might look like. And we talked a little bit in the introduction to the volume about how we're redefining the battlefield. We're kind of talking about the impact of the new military history on Civil War studies. And I think what we hope to show, and I think what we're trying to show, is that there isn't that much of a division between traditional military history and other sorts of fields in Civil War studies, maybe not as much as we feared. There are people that are incorporating all sorts of methodologies to tell the story of the war in pretty cool ways.
I think and John, I'll let you get the final question here, but just an observation. I think one of the great challenges now is the simple cost of books. And again, I'm not leveling a criticism at academic presses. I am an editor for a series at UNC Press with Carrie Janey and Aaron Sheehan Dean. This book was published, in fact, both of your books, Drew, as you well know, published by LSU. What's this retail for, Drew?
Yeah.
How much does it retail for, roughly? I think it's like 45, no? Is that much?
Right.
It's expensive, but I'm not well versed on the economics of university presses. The cost of producing physical copies of books is pretty significant, right?
Oh my God! And
they're not making presses. Yeah.
And they're not making money.
They're not making a lot of money.
So this isn't, again, a criticism of the presses. This is the financial reality in which they live. My point is that this fine scholarship, right, that's coming from academic presses, and even Evan's book is another example right here. I mean, Evan's book just came out in paper. They didn't even issue a limited hardback. Again, I want to stress, I'm not criticizing any press. They're dealing with the reality. But that reality is going to make it more and more challenging for us to continue to open up those lines of communication with those historians who are independent historians, or with those popular audiences as well. So it's a challenge. Of course, there's no easy answer to that, except I guess go to your public library and check the books out.
We should also note too that the historians who write these books really don't make much money at all on these either. So so it's just the cost is so much that it just costs that much to get these things out in print, unfortunately.
Yeah, a good academic selling book these days, a good one will sell around 2,000 copies. 2,000 copies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is a stunning and alarming fact that you spend somewhere between 5 to 10 years researching and writing a book, and it now the point is it does get to libraries, and the point also is it's part of a conversation, and in its own ways it will imbue right debates to come. So, John, I'll leave it to you for a final question here for Drew.
Yeah. Well, Drew, a lot of my followers are actually undergrads. They're in grad school. They're thinking about going on to major in history and such. For those who have commented tonight or haven't seen us yet, some of them are military historians, want to be military historians. What kind of words of advice would you give to an undergrad right now who wants to study Civil War military history or something like that, because it is a changing, evolving field?
Yeah, very much so. And I probably don't need to reiterate all the dire warnings about this career path in the academic job market and all that. So I won't, certainly won't do that. And I would never discourage any grad student from not pursuing their passion. I ignored a lot of, I think, probably pretty solid advice to go to grad school, and fortunately it's worked out so far. But not everybody is going to be that fortunate. But I will say that for some people, for me, was almost a haphazard sort of thing. I mean, I went to Rice. It was a wonderful graduate experience, and I had an outstanding experience there. But this is a conversation I actually had with Earl Hess. I hope he doesn't mind if I share this, but we were talking about as far as historian of the Civil War in graduate school, it's not something that necessarily is easy to do. In my case, I did a lot of it on my own. Honestly, I sort of learned the basics of military history by watching, by reading, by talking to people, rather than sort of a formal program. Now, having said that, there are, of course, some outstanding military history graduate programs here in the U.S. I think in UNC and Ohio State immediately come to mind, Temple and others that have a rigorous approach to training graduate students in military studies, military history. But it's something to keep in mind that the job market being what it is, a narrow job market. So becoming a military historian in these times is maybe a bit challenging. So anyway, I know that's not nearly as optimistic, as encouraging as some folks probably want to hear, but I think it's possible to do. But remember that sometimes the path there is not necessarily going to be a smooth and easy one.
And Drew, I think your professional journey, I think, should inspire other people. Look, you were a lawyer. You went through law school, man. But at the end of the day, you had to follow your calling. You swing for the fences. Only good things can come out of it. Yes, you're right. Sometimes you might not get to the Holy Grail and get that academic job, but somehow, some way, you'll find that opportunity to dig into your passion, right? And so, I think Drew is. I think it should serve as a source of inspiration. Man, you don't want to look back on your life and say you didn't try. And
yeah, thanks for that, Peter.
John will be starting.
It really, there's always elements of risk in big career decisions like that, and it was a big risk for me. But I reached a point where I realized that I was doing something I didn't really want to do anymore, and I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. And so I took the risk and was very, very fortunate, very fortunate. So I think that's good advice. And no matter what field you end up doing, it's worthwhile to pursue the thing that you love in whatever way that you can.
Yeah, regret's the worst thing in the world, right? You don't want to have that.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, for me too, Drew. It was I worked in a warehouse and I paved roads and I did all that, and I said this isn't for me. I don't want to do this for another 30 years, and I went back and earned my undergrad and grad, and now pushing on to Ontario to get my PhD. And I never knew 10, 15 years ago that, slinging 300-degree, stuff out of the shovel onto the road, I was going to get into this. But here I am because I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I didn't try.
Yeah, and I suspect that experience is going to make you a better historian. And who knows how, but it certainly will, I'm sure.
That's
I
right.
hope. I hope.
Yeah.
Drew, it was such a pleasure having you here. And again, we look forward to getting you up to Gettysburg, I hope soon, to hear you live and in person. For our next show is Monday evening. It is hosting Carrie Janey of Page County, Virginia, but now the John Now Professor of Civil War History. And she will be conversing with us about the demobilization or the breakup of Lee's Army in Northern Virginia after Appomattox. So you all stay safe. Have a great weekend. John, you and I will work on the theme song for next week.
Yeah, we're going to have to do that. We'll see what we can get by with without being sued.
All right. That's right.
Thank
All
you
right.
again, Drew, for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, man.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Bye.